You're listening to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence, and I've had the opportunity to interview many of those who are making a difference at the intersections of yoga and health. And I'm here to share with you their stories and conversations. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, I interviewed Dr. Joe Tafur. Dr. Tafur, MD, is an integrative family physician, curandero, author, and speaker. His acclaimed book, The Fellowship of the River, explores the role of spiritual healing in modern healthcare. Dr. Tafur currently offers integrative medical services virtually and in association with Day Trip Psychedelic Wellness Center in Phoenix, Arizona. He also provides telemedicine services to individuals in Arizona and California. Generally, I speak on this podcast with individuals who work in the space of yoga and healing. Today, we'll speak more about plant medicine and healing, but the common denominator for both yoga and plant medicine is the spiritual aspect of healing, one that's generally missing in modern healthcare. It's great to have you here on the podcast today, Joe.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Great to be here.
Can you share with our listeners a small bit of your story and what brought you, someone who's trained in Western medicine, to explore traditional Amazonian plant medicine?
Yeah, I think the basic, I kind of reviewed in my book and stuff is I got depressed in medical school and I was kind of struggling and having a hard time and looking for help. And then I really responded to sacred plant medicine ceremony here in Arizona. I had an opportunity to experience peyote at this place called the Peyote Way Church in Arizona. And that really turned me around. And so then that made me very curious about that kind of healing. And my family's from Colombia, South America. And so I knew about ayahuasca. I knew that existed. And I just had an increasing curiosity about that. And then eventually went to Peru to experience it and had a, big opening there and a big curiosity and started going back to learn more and then started leading groups there and then became friends with one of the healers and with some other colleagues. And we started our own healing center down there in Peru. And I lived down there and worked there and trained there. And I came back and wrote a book about it. And so now I'm doing that. We're in a process here in Arizona. We have our spiritual community that's actually in a legal process with the government to try to protect, our right to utilize ayahuasca and sacred ceremony in the United States. So going through that right now. Yeah, a few other things. Yeah.
That's great. And so what you were training in Western medicine really did not provide the solution for the depression that you were going through. And basically, as I understand it from your book, that's what put you on that path to explore something else and something deeper and something that really got to the root of how you were feeling more than the surface.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and I think that's generally true. I think you can probably say in the Western treatment of depression has not been that impressive, right? That's something the Western culture is struggling with. And so it raises the question along the lines of what you're interested in and working on is what is the root of that and what does that represent? And for me, in my experiences, it was a spiritual disconnection, that I felt like medical school was kind of hammering me through. And that's where I really lost my inspiration. Mm-hmm. And so then it's about how do you rediscover that or how do you reconnect to that kind of essence? I think that yoga and the long tradition, of yoga in the Eastern or at least the Hindu traditions or, however we want to describe them, but from over there in South Asia, the deep wisdom about what's really going on, and what is the source of this essential energy that nourishes us on a spiritual level and that interacts with us on an emotional level and then ends up impacting us on a mental and a physical level, and can we get by without addressing that?
It's tough. I mean, in yoga therapy, we look at the whole individual, all 5 layers, and we call that the koshas or the Panchamaya kosha model.
And we see the human being as being interconnected and all parts important in the healing process. And we understand like we're not a body separated from the mind, separated from energy, separated from emotions and spirit, but a whole person. And it's my understanding that other traditions and other modalities and plant medicine look at the human in a similar way. The concept is similar, even though the language might be different. And so in your experience, and I also find it interesting that you use the word inspiration, like you lost your inspiration
Right.
in medical school. And like in that word inspiration is the word spirit as well, you
Correct.
know. And so you've worked with a lot of individuals now. It's been some time since medical school and you've done a lot and you've got these traditional healing practices that you work with now too. Can you share a couple of stories, perhaps from your book, of individuals, like case studies of whole person healing that occurred through the process of plant medicine? I know particularly you've had experience with individuals who've had PTSD and addiction.
Yeah, there's definitely, those are big focus areas of the current like psychedelic, clinical kind of renaissance, the PTSD, addiction, depression, anxiety. And then in the book, I tried to explore like, what you were talking about and the kind of continuity across the mind body, into the flesh and the emotional and the spiritual, and trying to demonstrate the way that kind of stuff is, like I said, the intersection between biology, emotion, and spirituality. And so as a doctor, then I picked a couple cases where that would be more obvious. One of them in the book is a Crohn's disease case, like an inflammatory bowel disease case. So somebody that has really severe inflammatory bowel disease, this guy had it so bad that he had already had a couple surgeries to remove parts of his intestines that had perforated and were leaking, stool into his abdomen and causing all these problems. He also, as I'm saying, as a family medicine doctor, when in my training in that time, and I think still today largely, but when you see somebody with Crohn's disease, if you just read the research, there's no question that there's a high comorbidity, with anxiety and depression, that there's a mental health piece that's very common. Like it doesn't take a lot of digging into the literature to see, oh, wow, this is an established fact that, there may be something going on here at a psychological level or perhaps at an emotional level. But, as a family medicine resident, like what you're just rushed, you're going to send them to the GI doctor and they're going to manage them, trying to calm the inflammation in their body with medication. And if they need surgery, I guess they'll get surgery, But as far as them getting to a psychiatrist or who's going to help them, or a yoga therapist or somebody, who's going to get them to some kind of holistic care. And so this individual, as it turns out, the reason he came, he was managing himself with his medication, and then, severe abdominal pain, intermittent, bloody diarrhea, and then, using some marijuana to manage those symptoms. And he wasn't really somebody that was trying to go to therapy anyway, so he wasn't helping himself in that regard. He was struggling with all of that. So you can't blame, there was probably some kind of mental health support available to him that he just wasn't going for. But then he ended up very depressed and was considering, suicide. And somehow he ended up down at the center in Peru. And through their approach, he had a miraculous, thing happened to him in about 3 weeks. His diet was terrible, as it turns out. So that wasn't helping anything. So getting him on this really clean, like you talk about the panchakarma and putting him through a purification physically, was a big part of his process. But, it just was revealed that he had been through all this trauma, physical trauma, sexual abuse as a child, like all these things that there was no, I don't know, in a way, there was nobody that was able to address those things effectively for him. Some of it was repressed and he had no idea, and later was verified, things that came out in the ceremonies. So he went through this really profound process that there was supernatural, elements in his case that were part of what he experienced. But he healed, like he healed in 3 weeks. He he came out of his depression. And he's a very strong case. Like, not everybody's going to respond like him, but it was a fascinating case because here's somebody that like has painful, bloody diarrhea that he's no longer having. That if you're trying to figure out the mind body, I mean, it's not, there's no more blood. It's like, it's not that hard to believe what happened to him. And then following him out, for a year to 2 years, like just continued improvement, continued resiliency in managing his stress. That was a big deal to see that case, and just to see that, that's what the book ends up being about. Is like, well, he needed help with the emotional and the spiritual dimensions of his problem. And if those were adequately addressed, there would be physical ramifications. So that's the big deal, because that's what they don't, this continuity, like, yes, it should work both ways. It should work all those ways, when you have this, whether it's through yoga or other ways that people, overcome, let's say some back pain, whether it's sciatica or just, there's a physical element, but there is an emotional element many times in the holistic healing that, where somebody was on this track to get surgery. Oh my God, you need surgery. That's the only answer. And then all of a sudden they find this emotional healing, they find this physical, therapeutic intervention, and then they don't, like they just don't at all. And so then you see like, okay, maybe we were missing the boat here. So that's what it's about. And that's a case to kind of talk about that. And so, I explore that in the book and all that stuff.
I wonder if we can stay with that case for a moment, that same one, and talk about the continuity of support and what that looks like in this model, right? So he goes down to Peru, he's there for 3 weeks. There's a healing process that's occurred, no doubt. It's obvious. Symptoms are gone. Now he goes back home, and you've followed him over the course of the next couple of years to see his sustained progress. But what are his protocols, if any, when he's back home? Like, how do we integrate?
Everybody needs to integrate, you know what I mean? Everybody needs to integrate in some form. And that's every patient, that's everybody that comes through any healer's path. So there is a personal responsibility involved. You know what I mean? I'm not going to follow everybody that comes through. If I'm working at a clinic, I'm not going to follow them home. Like, so in the traditional medicine system, and I think in the yoga tradition, I don't think there's any question about the role of the personal responsibility of the care. So in his case, he's somebody that was coming out of not wanting to go to therapy, or, dealing with a divorce, and he was going through a lot. And so the first steps for him in his integration, as I think it has to start somewhere, was he had to go and deal with these relationships that were really like turned out to be at the root of his problem. So for him, that was really major, to go home and talk to his stepfather that used to beat him up his whole childhood, who's still with his mom, and, have some big conversations about what happened, and work towards some kind of forgiveness. And, in this case, receive an apology from a guy that regretted, this behavior, but to actually go through that process, and that there was a big emotional release that was significant as far as the impact on his body, to go through that, to go and talk to his cousins and find out, is it true that in the ayahuasca visions, it looks like I got abused, by this aunt, and, what's the story behind that, and investigate and find out, yes, actually, that did happen, and other people verify that happened, and then starting to work through that process of coming to terms and talking to those people and talking to his mom and sorting all that out. So I think there's some very real human stuff that can be very helpful, that I encourage people a lot to work through, their relationships, which are so core to all this stuff, to whatever degree that is possible. And then beyond that, in his case, he improved his diet. Like, he used to eat this bacon, whatever, breakfast sandwich every single day, and he stopped. And he went from using, regular steroid medication to intermittent medicinal marijuana to calm if he did have any beginning signs of symptoms. He had access to Svita, who was my business partner in Peru, and she lived up there in his area. And so she could check in with him as a form of support. to follow up and, check in. How is he doing? What's going on? So, that's just the reality of him. I'm throwing that out there because, people are saying, okay, what's the integration plan? And what I'm like, I don't know. What is the integration plan?
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for the integration plan?
Yeah.
So what the integration plan is human culture.
It is. And it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, there is this high probability of lack of compliance in a way,
Of
right?
course.
And on the flip side of that, there's also a probably high probability of success when one takes the personal responsibility, right? And my sense in plant medicine ceremonies and healing that happens there, and also like through a yoga experience, for example, the experience itself is so motivating that the empowerment and the responsibility of the individual is sort of bolstered by that, right?
Sure. I think there's, I think one thing like observing healing in the Amazon and, talking about is like that there's a difference, there's a big difference between like weekend ceremony in the States versus like a 3-week dieta, in the Amazon with these healers. So this guy, and the reason I bring it up is because, they've done a little bit of research studies around the 12-day dietas at this place called the Temple of the Way of Light in Peru, and the following up 1 year, 2 year follow up. So the idea that you could really potentially impact somebody, with a really transformative experience, like an in-depth experience. Of course, they would have to follow up and comply and be more integrated, but that kind of impact would be dramatically different from a weekend experience in the States, so people may not have that much real exposure to what's possible with those kind of plants and those kind of medicines, seeing people just kind of pop in and out of so I just want to throw that out there that
Yeah.
So it's true that in those kind of weekend experiences and stuff that, yeah, you could be the inspiration, it could be the window could open, but that, hey, this guy's in a 3-week like deeply immersed process, that would be when you see somebody go through a 7-day vipassana or a 1-month yoga retreat, it's like that you see that it's like, whoa, that's you could just blow that off, but it does usually have a bigger impact. So then there's that piece, like what is the deeper integration and what is the deeper healing process? Like, does the deeper healing process, a retreat is a great way to go about it because so, you do need all that time to reflect and, squeezing it in here and there and here and there. It's tough. It's tough for people, so the reset a lot of times comes from a more immersion kind of experience.
Yeah, all that makes a lot of sense and is relatable from my perspective too, in terms of what we do on yoga retreat. And I think from the perspective of a yoga therapist, like when we're working with individuals, we are seeking to impart like slow progress over time, like consistent daily habits that don't have to be huge. And so I could see that being sort of a beneficial integration path for individuals who want to continue their healing, right?
I totally agree. We do in our
your
Colombia,
life. Mm-hmm.
in our Colombia retreats, we have a yoga practitioner, that just is bringing the daily yoga practice to those retreats. It's Sochi's brother Cesar, who just loves yoga and is so dedicated, and just it brings such a beautiful daily practice and the physicality, but he also has a kind of meditation focus and his yoga, and it just brings it all together, the wholeness of it. So I just think that there's no question that it's a beautiful addition to such work. And I think that the deeper root of it with the chakra work and with the there is that profound metaphysical science of it that runs very deep and is also about finding that kind of energetic balance within one's being, and like the metaphysical side of that, which I think really crosses over into the ayahuasca curanderismo. Like there's no question that focusing on certain, let's say, chakra energy centers is interrelated. So there's something there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and maybe talk about acceptance of this sort of whole person health. Like, so since the time you were in medical school and subsequently wrote your book, Fellowship of the River, which I love the title. And it wasn't until like I obviously started reading the book that I understood where it came from. And
Yeah.
I thought that was just so great.
Yeah.
But do you think there's a wider acceptance of the role of spirituality today in modern healthcare? And then, like, what do we mean when we say spiritual healing?
Yeah, I think that it's mixed. So then that's, my area of interest right now is that I think the psychedelic renaissance is like the strongest push to kind of reignite an interest in spirituality as it relates to healthcare. And so that's an evidence-based prong that is entering mental health care. And so it's becoming more and more difficult to ignore it as a reality. In other words, it's kind of like trauma-informed healing, is like, okay, if you could try to deny the role of trauma, how could childhood trauma lead to this guy's Crohn's disease, and just kind of blow it off and talk like that, which I would say is pretty common, in the medical culture that I came up in. But now, if you're not, it's like you're basically ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is just like, hey, we're just a little compassion for you. Like maybe we need something's going on. Like you're having a hard time catching up. Something's blocking you from understanding, how things are. And in the case of this, I think it is very interesting. And so the way the psychedelic therapeutics are kind of, starting to really rock the psychiatric world, turning people around with MDMA who've had 20 years of PTSD that, previous models could not touch. And these people were basically cast out as, broken. And you can't fix that person, that kind of problem that they have. They're going to die like that. And then all of a sudden you can, a very high percentage of them. So what is the key to what happened to them? And so then that's starting to like open these doors and open these questions about what's going on, and you see, like I always bring it up, but the MDMA, you're in the VITAL program, the protocol, the FDA approved protocol for the MDMA assisted therapy involves, helping someone contact their inner healer. This metaphysical concept is at the core of where you're trying to get somebody to plug into. And so what does that mean? Who is the inner healer? And so then we talk about other ways that spirituality starts making its way into the medical model. They talk about a sense of meaning. That's a universal concept that people are willing, rational, materialistic people are willing to entertain. That if you have no meaning, that yes, you lose this inspiration we were talking about. That word that has a spiritual root, but has somehow become secularized, but again, in ignorance, because what exactly are you saying? Of course, that's what you're saying. That's what it always has meant. That's what that word means, is that you feel like inspired, that you feel connected to an energy in the way that the yogis are talking about being connected to prana. That's what that word means. That's why we're using it. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, so those things are metaphysical concepts, you might say, or they're at least transcendent concepts, or they're, we're trying to find more universal language to not upset people, because there's a lot of religious trauma that's really at the root of that resistance, mm-hmm. to the spirituality. Mm-hmm. So like if you bring it up, and then that triggers a lot of people to, whether they had family trauma or they had this trauma or whatever it was, abuses that have happened within the religious, institutions that, that go all the way back to like, majors. I mean, there's all kinds of major stuff, but, Ken Wilber talks about how, maybe the break away from spirituality, part of it is like that, the Catholic Church had a stranglehold on Western culture for centuries. And, if you try to tell them that the earth is going around the sun, they're going to, burn you at the stake. And so it's like, after a while, the scientists are like, get those guys out of here. Like, they killed my friend. It's like, it's violent. The friction that has been there in many parts of it. And so it's like, so that's why I say it's so important to find ways to talk about it that can kind of lead towards a more universal discussion. Obviously, the yoga and frameworks like that, they provide a way, indigenous frameworks provide a way, to talk about it more broadly. And so now, at the psychedelic conference this past year, I was invited to present along people from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, from the Divinity School, chaplains who've been involved in the psychedelic research, from the get-go. Like, that's always been kind of welcome to the psychedelic clinical model. It's like, okay, well, you can have a licensed therapist, but the FDA also, well, you could chaplain is qualified to help people through that process.
Mm-hmm.
Because why? Because everybody knows that they're going to encounter like a lot of spiritual content. And so what is that? And so then they created a word that they published in their papers from Emory University called the CERT, the latest acronym from the Western model. It's spiritual, religious, existential, or theological experiences. So saying, these certs are very common in the psychedelic experience. And we're seeing this cert keeps coming up when people are going through these clinical psychedelic treatments. And so we realize that the cert is common. So we need to kind of like, we can't ignore it because it's there it is. Here's the percentage. Here's the statistics. This many percentage of the time, somebody's going to have a cert, on psilocybin or something like that. So then second point, through our research and our statistical analysis, we've realized the cert is clinically relevant. What happens to them in regards to these experiences ends up impacting their health. And so this would, strengthen the argument that we need to bring spiritually educated people into this kind of work to help people because they can draw upon their cultural wisdom, whether that's a yoga tradition or, Christian theology, whatever that is, to help people, shipibo curanderismo, you could say. And so then to draw upon the multi-generational wisdom of what is it like for people's souls to go through life, and how do we work through stuff that's really hard? How do we find forgiveness? How do we, for ourselves, for others, how do we find compassion? How do we find gratitude? How do we find love for ourselves? So those topics, I just listed those 4. That was, in a publication from psilocybin research from NYU or one of those places where they're like, hey, as much as this other content keeps coming up, this content was extremely consistent in what people went through and their process of decreasing their symptoms of depression. So that's what it is right now. Like the evidence is there. And so how do you get it across to people? Well, helping them find a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. How do they address, their existential questions in life that are surrounding them?
It's interesting. You said things like compassion and gratitude, love for oneself. I mean, there's also like a whole separate field of research that indicates how important those things are for your mental health. So if these are experiences you're having through a psychedelic process, right, and they are markers of spiritual well-being in a way, separately, they're also known to be beneficial for your mental health. So there's no surprise, right, that
Exactly.
these things come together to benefit the whole person.
So we're back to that, like inspire
Yeah.
talk. It's like, okay, inspire as a word. Here we are using it. And then guess what?
Uh-huh.
We're using the word love. We're using the word compassion. We're using the word gratitude. We're using the word forgiveness, which have for
Mhm.
thousands of years been, within the realm squarely of spiritual growth.
Yeah.
So we can secularize it and say, okay, I'm saying love. And, I'm just saying love, but I don't want to talk about church. I don't want to talk about God. It's like, okay, but I'm just saying that that word is like, has a steeped in this relationship to the mystery. And so it's just, that there's something about that. Like there's something about the historical, ancestral, cultural connection to, like you
Mhm.
said, to inspire, to, that we've distanced ourselves so much in the short term, in the last few generations from the mysterious side of life, which was much more present, I think. And, whatever, if you read Isaac Newton or, all these people,
Yeah.
even Albert Einstein,
Yeah.
it's like that. These were discussions that they could have in the 1920s and 30s. And, it wasn't so taboo. And
Yeah.
now, you're like a heretic if you bring these things up.
Yeah. And by the way, I also feel like another prong that might be like approaching spirituality and healthcare is the field of yoga therapy. And so it could
Yeah.
be, and that's why my interest crosses over
No,
so
it's so important.
frequently between this work of psychedelics and the yoga therapy is obviously like where I am as a professional, but there's just so much common ground that both traditions, if you want to call them that, cover. Yeah.
Well, it's so true. And I think it's really about, to me, that it's about ancestral traditions that are more comprehensive and holistic, through wisdom, through the experience of lived experience over generations. They have come to this conclusion that, hey, it's a whole being, and it's in continuity with the universe, as it turns out. And so then, it's not, Chinese medicine and the ancient Chinese, philosophy. And then it turns out a bunch of other global philosophies, outside of the Western philosophy. And here in the United States, like, very suppressed and marginalized, but the Native American, spiritual traditions, of course, agree with this. And so that's like this, for whatever it's worth, just to throw it out there, this workshop that we're doing, that's Josie Begay James, my friend, Navajo medicine woman. She's just like, hey, what do I observe from the Westerners? Like, well, they don't want to address the spiritual side of their patients. But, she's like, in truth, in her estimation, her cultural perspective, well, people are spiritual beings. And so if you don't address that, then you're in denial and you won't be able to finish off what they're working on.
Tell me more about the workshop you've got coming up.
Yeah, so I'll just bring it up.
When is it? And
It's
yeah.
January 20th, okay,
Okay.
through modernspirit.org, through our, our nonprofit, which is dedicated to demonstrating the value of spiritual healing in modern healthcare. And so we have been focused on, some of the indigenous spiritual traditions from the Americas. Here we are living in the United States, and my family's from Colombia. In these Americas, there's a lot of wisdom about this and our relationship with nature, and as we're facing, this ecological disaster. So this is a day-long workshop, and it's called Sacred Ceremony and Psychedelic Therapy. So it's people that are very experienced in traditional ceremony and aware of this psychedelic psychotherapeutic practice that's developing. And so in the morning, we're going to be sharing with Sochi Bukuru, who's an indigenous healer from Colombia, very experienced in ayahuasca ceremony, assists me with groups of therapists that we've been taking down to Colombia. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be working with Josie Begay James. And, then the three of us will be involved in some panels throughout and answering a lot of questions. Josie Begay James is a Diné, Navajo medicine woman, like a lot of experience with ceremony and ritual, and also in peyote ceremony in her tradition. And so she's very comfortable working with people in altered states and, deeply spiritual experiences. And so they're going to be teaching about their holistic view of human beings and earth and the continuity of mind, body, spirituality, matter, and the invisible realms, all of that. They're going to be talking about that as it relates to the healing that they've been a part of and the work that they do. And just as you have said, yeah, the integration. And then that's what I'm saying, ultimately, like, and it's not so easy because it's for us, we have a long ways to go, but the integration becomes about human culture.
Mm-hmm.
So they're coming from cultures where, that obviously there's been a lot of struggle and difficulty, but at least that's not in ignorance. They're like, yeah, we have to eventually get to a place where the culture itself is going to be a place that's going to support people going through those kind of experiences and coming home. And, where if you want to do yoga because for your health, for your spiritual health, for your emotional health, for your physical health, that other people would be behind you. Hey, that's a great idea. Like that's really beneficial. Why wouldn't you want to do that? Like that's versus resistance that's born in a lot of other things, and some of them are pathological and some of them are culturally pathological. So it's about like trying to heal, and it's about trying to, that part of that like ancestral connection that we were just talking about yoga and Chinese medicine. Yeah, that's really missing here in the Americas. And because of the way things have evolved in the colonial situation here in the United States, that we are largely cut off from that wisdom that people are going to be connected to along the Ganges in India, and watching these traditions that have happened for thousands of years that are helping them understand, about life and death. And so when you cut yourself off and pretend like we just started over and, we're just making it up as we go along, and don't worry, we'll figure this out. If we just make enough money, it'll work itself out. A fool's path.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no question that this has been established, whether it's in the Bible or however far back you want to go through Western culture to understand that, hey, there's some red flags here. So how do we root ourselves again? And do we need to root ourselves in this land again? And how do we reopen the doors to these indigenous cultures that, of course, they have their wounds and their resentment, to be willing to help us kind of understand like where we are, and can we find a place to reconnect to prayers that have been happening on these lands where we live and where many people's children are growing up for thousands of years, where you have to figure out that inspire means spirit, but you don't even know like what was the sacred place that's on this hill by where you live, and why did they think that?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that would be useful to
Mm-hmm.
us. Maybe that would help us have more of a sense of belonging. Maybe that would help us feel more grounded and more rooted, and in that sense, less scattered, less, wobbly, quick and swinging this way, polarizing that way, just on a dime.
Yeah.
So that's what we're like. That's the workshop is about, helping people to explore that, but also as it relates to everything you're talking about. We talk about energy healing and spiritual healing as it relates to Dene culture and wisdom, to Colombian indigenous wisdom, and they're gonna share that with us, and as it relates to people's healing and their spiritual walk and their integration. And you're gonna see what's their integration. These people are praying every day and doing rituals regularly, just like some of these dedicated yogis.
Yep. Yeah. It sounds great, and I'll share information about it in the show notes, so make sure people can read more about it and hopefully participate too.
Yeah, that would be great.
I
Thank
see
you.
how relevant it is to what we do as well, how
Mhm.
connected. So I have one last question, and I kind of ask this to each of the guests I've had on the podcast, and it has to do with like getting a little insight into your own personal spiritual practice. So when we train yoga therapists, we really place a lot of importance on having your own spiritual practice first, which comes before holding space for other people and
Yeah.
doing any of that work with others. And so I imagine, like yourself, you might have a similar approach to life. It might not be a yoga practice, but maybe you have some daily practices that are important that kind of keep you on your spiritual path. And if you do, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah. I grew up going to church. Like that's my family's very Catholic. I broke away from that, but I grew up kind of where that was a regular thing in life, to go to church or to spiritual practice or something was around. And then I kind of like, got away from that. And then in college, got exposed to like meditation, or then got exposed to some other traditional practices, whether that was then eventually like sweat lodge and think, just a mix of things. And then in Peru, I got like, immersed in living kind of a ceremonial existence day in, day out. And then I came back here and now I'm like defining that for myself, right? And so service was a big part of it for me, which is kind of a classic yoga thing. So I think the
Oh.
service was a big part of the practice for me. And then, but maybe too much, like a little carried away in the
Mhm.
service department. But I think there's a lot of growth that comes from that, in my daily, I mean, I am usually involved in some kind of service most days, helping somebody or somehow. But for myself, like in the morning, I like the idea, and there's it's popular here in Arizona among the native tribes. Like they believe in praying, in the early dawn, that's a time to speak to the spirits, to wake up and, take some time to be grateful, to I don't do enough yoga. I want to do more yoga, but try to go for a walk. I try to do like physical kind of walking meditation. I do a lot of walking, um, to spend some time to reflect once in a while. Like there's a lot of in the Shipibo tradition, the native traditions, and if you're a healer and you do that kind of work, then there's a lot of like thought about kind of cleansing, that you need to like cleanse regularly, to you pick up a lot of energy dealing with a lot of people. So then there's like different things you do to address that, whether that's like saging your house or saging yourself, or, in our case, like going into ceremony with some regularity, whether that's, sometimes it's ayahuasca, sometimes I just went on Saturday to attend a day-long Navajo ceremony, so just like attending ceremonies and rituals, and that they're going to be bringing that vibration that's going to kind of refresh and reinvigorate oneself. So it's just my daily is probably just like a little bit of, gratitude prayer and a little meditative walking, some degree of service, at the end of the day, like trying to again like come back into some gratitude before, going to sleep.
Mhm.
So
It's
yeah, I need to
interesting.
do more work to organize my my
Not
daily
really. I
practice, but I
mean,
do I do a lot.
what's coming to my mind is as a yoga practitioner, like my daily doesn't look very different from yours,
Hmm.
actually,
Yeah,
and I consider those same things to be part of my practice.
yeah,
Oh, that time in reverence and
yes,
gratitude and that time connect for me, like being out in nature does connect me to spirit.
yes.
And when you live in a beautiful place, how could you not like make that part of your
That's
daily?
what it is, and I think that's what it comes down to, is that reverence and making time on a daily basis for the reverence, which like in our tradition, and I think the traditions here, and I think across the board, and I think it's true in yoga, and I think it's true in meditation, and a lot of other things I see, but just different flavors. For us, the reverence is about, well, for me, it's about listening to become part of a larger whole. And in that, there's guidance. And so then that's like trying to understand, what, in Colombia, they say, you have all the different thoughts, you have your mind is like that, full of thoughts. Like, which one is the right one? Which one should you go with? Where is your feeling? How is your heart in this moment as you try to proceed? And really like trying to spend time in that reverence where you could try to, this inspiration that we talked about, that is a connection. That's the thing. That's the traditional way. They
Mhm.
say, yeah, think beautifully. Yeah, sure, you should, speak beautifully. Yeah, that's nice. but most of all, connect beautifully. That there is something to connect to, and that's this energy that we're a part of, and that's the wholeness, that is everything, that is positive, negative, tragic, beautiful, but there's a wholeness that we're a part of, and that's where we can find the inspiration, and that inspiration is energy that nourishes us, and it's something that is tangible and that we can feel, and it's the difference between the person that feels inspired to the person who doesn't feel inspired.
Yeah. So beautiful. I loved everything you've shared today. Thank you so much. It was really great speaking with you, and I look forward to continuing our conversation in whatever form that might be at some point in the future. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we do, visit us at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.